It is already a recognised and well-established fact that the force of gravity and the flow of time are intimately interconnected. The equation which describes the difference in the respective gravitational forces experienced by the two clocks at different heights is equivalent to the equation which describes the time difference between the two clocks. This is all to do with special and general relativity. If we were to define gravity simply as an invisible force which attracts all matter to other matter, it is possible to describe the phenomena of the invisible attractive force in terms of the field exclusively representing the dimension of time, without the need or requirement to then describe the phenomena as being caused by a force which is separate and independent from the field of time, and which we call, namely, the force of gravity. And the attractive force can alternatively be explained as being a consequence of the influence of the curvature and bending of the field of time of the planet, which exists below our feet. Einstein asserted himself that his theory of general relativity regarded gravity as a fictitious force which emerged from the curvature of space-time. The following illustration represents the structure of a field of time as envisaged by this model. The first thing to say is that the geometry of the field is assumed to be separate and independent of the existence of matter and of any pre-existing three-dimensional space. A field of time has a specific finite radius as indicated by this circumference. This internal shell drawn at the middle of the radius is just to indicate the spherical geometry of the field as a whole. In this model of an atom, the field does not originate at the nucleus, but at the shell. The shell can be regarded as occurring as a unique, dimensionless, static point in the vacuum of empty space. The surface of the shell represents the beginning of a timeline, which is relative only to that specific field of time. The nucleus X is regarded as a corresponding static point coordinate, merely by virtue of the fact that relative to any point on the surface of the shell, X represents the geometrical focal centre point of the field of time. As such, in this model of the field of time, the nucleus of itself represents a dimensionless notional point in empty space, which is relative to nothing other than itself and therefore possessing zero mass and zero energy. Every field of time has an inherent instantaneous interior, radial and spherical geometry as defined within the interior of the circumference of the shell. Any given internal radius defines a notional internal sphere, such as that which occurs here. The laws which apply to the formation of a field of time is a fundamental universal constant which applies everywhere in the universe. In the one dimension of the field of time, the three dimensions of space and the concept of comparative size and scale have no meaning. Now at this stage, this particular field of time could and can represent either an atom of neutral hydrogen, it can also represent a planet, a star, a galaxy, a black hole. In fact, any structure which is rotating on its axis and which is orbiting a larger mass, at the most fundamental level is essentially a unique finite field of time. If we take the extrapolation to the logical cosmological conclusion, then ultimately this particular field of time can also represent the Big Bang beginning of time of the observable universe. Right now I will refer to this geometry of the field of time simply as an atom, whilst keeping in mind that the same rules of the internal geometry of the field applies throughout the cosmos. Every atom in the universe at the most fundamental level, and before it is anything else, represents a field of time. The first thing to point out here is that with regards to the formation of planets, the shell of the field of time of that planet does not represent that planet's solid surface, but instead represents the outermost edge of that planet's atmosphere, if it has one, beginning with the single hydrogen atoms at the outermost edge of the atmosphere and culminating with the denser, heavier elements at its nucleus. For instance, the boundary of the time shell relative to the Earth occurs at an altitude of approximately 3,200 kilometres or so above the surface of the planet. The only element which exists at that altitude are single atoms of hydrogen. Similarly, this arrangement agrees with the fact that the core of the Earth is believed to be mostly consists of a solid mass of iron. Now, regardless of the position of any external observer, the face which the shell presents to the viewer establishes a static nucleus with 4 notional opposing points. These points on the 2-dimensional plane translate in the 3 dimensions of physical reality as the north and south magnetic poles and the positive and negative electric poles. It is a fundamental condition of every field of time that it possesses a property which can be compared to the viscosity of a fluid. The viscosity of the field of time is a variable quantity which is measured at 0 at the outer shell and increases to infinity at the nucleus, or a viscosity of infinite density. The degree by which the viscosity of the field of time varies between any 2 points on the radial line is infinitely smooth and continuous. As such, the measurement between any 2 points on a radial line, regardless of their degree of separation, can always be divided infinitely and without limit by 2. The field of time, or in other words, the interior of the atom, has an intrinsic instantaneous geometry which represents a curvature of the internal vacuum of the atom, or the atom's interior. The intrinsic geometrical curvature of the field dictates that the transfer of information between any 2 points on any given radial line within the field must follow a spiral geodesic path. And because of the influence of the variable viscosity of the field, the geodesic path of the transfer of information takes the form of an expanding logarithmic golden spiral. If we take a hypothetical massless particle, and let's call this particle a time photon, which originates at an internal shell of time, must follow the already established geometrical curvature of the field of time between the 2 points. The rotational velocity of the time photon at any given radius or shell within the atom is determined by the specific viscosity of the field at that radius. The velocity of the time photon on the curved line determines the rate at which time flows for a clock positioned at that radius, and also represents the relative value of the speed of light when measured at that shell or that radius. When the viscosity of the field equals zero, the rotational velocity of the flow of time at that radius possesses a precise velocity of 300,000 kilometers per second. This specific velocity can be regarded as representing the fundamental value of the speed of light in a vacuum. At the atomic scale, this shell represents the electron orbital shell of neutral hydrogen. Now, the further logical assumption is that the viscosity of the time field of the planet, and therefore the contraction of time, continues to increase below the surface of the planet. There is no reason to assume that a clock situated 1 centimetre below sea level will not tick slower than a clock situated at sea level. The implication, therefore, is that if we extend the increase in the viscosity of the field and the contraction of time to the nucleus of the planet, we ultimately end up with a dimensionless static point singularity in empty space located at the centre of the planet, possessing infinite viscosity, or density if you want to put it that way, and where time has effectively stopped. An object which is located within any region of the field of time, such as an object resting on the surface of the planet, can only be influenced by the interior regions of the field. The influence of the external region of the field on the object is zero. The sum effect of the field of time on the object from the perspective of existing in three-dimensional physical reality is perceived as a net downward force. For every atom of matter of which your body is made, you can draw a straight line of influence directly connected to the nucleus of the planet. Now, it is irrelevant that the angle between any two adjacent atoms in our body, when measured 6,317 kilometres away at the nucleus of the planet, will necessarily be a minuscule angle. You have to remember that the field of time is infinitely smooth and continuous, with no parameters of measurement. And at the Planck scale, it represents an angle between the two atoms nonetheless, regardless of how acute that angle is. The natural law of physics is that everything tends towards maximum entropy and stasis of the system. This is the fundamental reason why the transfer of information and energy itself will always take the path of least resistance. When we apply this principle to a massless particle like a time photon, the layers of time below its present position in the field of time will always represent a lower level of energy. When translated into 3 dimensions, the pull of time towards the static point nucleus of the planet equates with a downward physical force. It is an intrinsic property of dark matter that it is not capable of interacting strongly with normal matter, other than through gravity. This model postulates that gravity as a field or a force which has an existence which is separate and independent of the field of time does not exist. If the rotational velocity of a galaxy cluster is regarded as following a geodesic path which is determined solely by a single cohesive field of time, it explains the flattening of the orbital velocity of galaxies beyond a certain radius. And it does so without having to invent the existence of dark matter in order to explain the discrepancy between the predicted and the observed orbital velocity of galaxies.